Legendary actress Joan Collins is known for glamour, confidence, and a commanding presence. But in the autumn of 1994, the paranormal shook her to the core. While staying in a centuries-old Venetian palace, Joan experienced something that no amount of fame or fortune could protect her from. And it began with unease, a shift in the atmosphere, but it ended with her and her friends fleeing from this mansion in terror. Tonight, we explore the first-hand account from a woman who's seen it all and yet still calls this the strangest experience of her life. I'm Peter Laws, and tonight on Into the Fog, we follow Joan Collins into the Campiello Albrizzi Palace and the haunting she will never forget. Joan Collins is perhaps best known as the glamorous and cunning Alexis in the 1980s TV phenomenon Dynasty. It was a role that made her an icon of television drama. But her career stretches way beyond that, from early film stardom in the 50s to decades of stage and screen work as well as writing books. And yet tonight, we're going to explore a lesser-known chapter in her life which she described as terrifying. Her paranormal encounter occurred in September 1994 in Venice, Italy. And the catalyst for these events was Lady Carol Bamford. She is a figure of wealth and influence known for her estates and successful business ventures. Carol wanted to give a birthday gift to her daughter Alice. Today, Alice is an author, film producer, and farmer, but back in 1994, she had just turned 18, and her mum wanted to treat her to something special. I don't just mean a meal in a nice restaurant, I'm talking about a 10-day vacation in a Venetian palace. Carol had employed a housekeeper for 17 years. Her name was Karen Keeling. Karen was sent ahead to Venice to find the right location for the holiday, and her boss had been clear. She wanted Alice to have the wonderful experience of old Venice, the romance, the grandeur. Well, Karen found exactly that in the historic and yet somewhat crumbling Campiello Albrizzi Palace. And if you've read about Joan's case online, you might notice some confusion about exactly where this all happened. That's because there are actually two Palazzo Albrizzis in Venice. One, Palazzo Albrizzi Cappello, is now an arts centre, but after sifting through the details, it seems clear that the party took place at the other, the historic and somewhat crumbling yet still beautiful Palazzo Albrizzi in San Polo, Venice. This mansion dates back to the 16th century and is still owned by the descendants of the Albrizzi family today, and it is still available to hire for vacations. Karen felt this mansion was perfect for this party and vacation, and so her boss, Carol, spent close to £20,000 to hire it for 10 days. There was a flurry of activity when the time of the trip came. As well as Karen Keeling, the Bamford's former chauffeur was also on hand to help set things up at the house. His name was Shawn Mullen, very important part of the story, both Shawn and Karen. There was also a butler called Gastone Brigama. He was on his first job there at the mansion, and there was a cook who had worked there before. More on her later. Well, this combination of Lady Bamford's staff and locals started to organise the caterers, the florists, to make sure the mansion looked opulent for when the guests turned up. Lady Bamford and Alice were very excited when they arrived at the palace, and so were the small circle of guests who had been invited to join them. These included artist Hugo Guinness, Alice's friend Caroline Wellesley, and Joan Collins herself, among others. She was accompanied on the trip by an antiques dealer called Robin Hurlstone. They were romantically linked at the time, and Robin would later act in two Wes Anderson films that director will feature in this paranormal story later. The moment they all stepped through the heavy wooden doors, the place seemed suspended in time. A grand hallway, towering ceilings, cracked frescoes, and old chandeliers hanging above them. And setting their suitcases down in the old mansion, they were impressed. Well, even though the trip was to treat Alice primarily, Hugo Guinness had a birthday at the start of this day. And so the plan was to celebrate that with a sumptuous meal on the first night, and they would have it in the dining room. The room had been set out with one of Carol Bamford's favourites, a bowl filled with dragées, which are kind of like a decorative sweet, often used in upscale dining. They'll be important later too. Now, despite the name, the dining room was not used for dining on account of its atmosphere. You see, it was rumoured to be haunted. But the guests, and particularly Lady Bamford's staff, weren't going to let a silly ghost story hold them back from using such a sumptuous, if spooky, room. Well, as they all got dressed for dinner upstairs and the staff prepared the meal, every single one of them was about to discover that what felt like it could be a haunted house actually was one. The guests came down to the dining room to gather, and the first sign of something being off was the temperature. When Joan Collins stepped foot into the dining room, she agreed with everybody else that the dining room was bizarrely cold. It was like walking into a different climate completely. She said the temperature drop was like 15 to 20 degrees Celsius. That's a huge plunge. And along with this biting cold, the dining room had a gloomy and oppressive feeling at first. She noticed, for example, how the walls were covered with weaponry like antique machetes, knives, and swords. But central to it all was what hung above the dining room table. It was a large, formal portrait. It was a woman dressed in noble finery. The flickering candlelight of the room gave her eyes a strange quality, almost reflective, almost alive. Joan would later say that she found this woman slightly off-putting because the woman looked furious. Well, despite the spooky vibes and shivery temperature, once the champagne started flowing, people chilled out, and soon the group were laughing together, discussing what they might do over their stay in Italy. And yet the atmosphere would soon change, and Joan was the one who noticed it in particular. It was already weirdly cold, but as Joan was sitting, she suddenly felt something against her legs. A shocking sensation of coolness on her feet and ankles. Now, this wasn't just a general draft or a wave of cold, it was a very concentrated feeling, so focused, in fact, that she instantly thought someone had crawled under the table and, for a joke perhaps, was blowing hard against the star's legs. Yet when she looked, there was nobody who had done such a thing. It was a remarkable moment for her, enough for goosebumps to ripple across her skin. And she asked the others, can't you feel that freezing cold draft under the table? They all looked at her like she was crazy. I mean, the room was cold, but they didn't feel this extra draft she was talking about. But then things got worse. Everybody jumped at the clattering sound of the shutters. Out of nowhere, the windows of the dining room flew open. Now, there was some extreme weather in Venice at this time. We're going to explore more of that later. But this window suddenly snapping back seemed strange and, frankly, unnatural. One of the men at the table rushed to one of these windows to close it, but he couldn't. No matter how hard he tried, it was like, well, Joan put it this way, like there was a force behind that window. Well, as spooky as these moments were, they still had a fun time together, and when the meal came to an end, the staff wished everybody a good night. That included, of course, Shawn and Karen. They were not staying at the Palazzo, by the way. The staff were in a nearby hotel. And as the workers left and the rest of the guests headed up to the rooms to sleep, they had all felt, well, it had been a pretty wonderful evening. But it was only the next morning when things really began to change. Because in time, they would come to learn that something in that house was seething with rage at their presence. The next morning, the guests rose from their beds and chatted to one another. How did you sleep? They asked. Well, Joan's partner Robin said that he had had an absolutely terrible night. He couldn't seem to relax enough in bed to drift off, and Joan said, to be honest, I experienced something similar. She never had trouble sleeping. In fact, she, quote, slept like a log normally. But in the Palazzo, she had had an awful night too. Similarly, as they gathered for breakfast, Alice and her friend Caroline had also struggled. They couldn't sleep because of the eerie atmosphere. They felt a spookiness so dense that they just couldn't bring themselves to close their eyes to sleep. Well, as they all discussed their challenging night over breakfast, something disturbing began to become apparent. They had all suffered from bad dreams, from nightmares. Dreams that Joan described as troubled and haunted. Disturbed sleep, nightmares, and emotionally intense dreams do sometimes feature in haunted house cases and can be one of the first signs that something is coming. That morning, the cook and the butler returned to the mansion to prepare a meal. Now remember that it was the butler's first time working at this mansion, but the cook had served here for many years. She knew the history of the place and the ghosts as well, which is why she got such a shock when an insect entered the kitchen that day. It was a black moth, not just any old one. This thing was huge. And when she saw it settle in the room, the cook became afraid. This was, she said, a sign. Yes, in some cultures, the appearance of a black moth is a bad omen, maybe signifying illness or death, but also can be seen as a manifestation of the dead. She told the butler that the moth like this was a signal that a paranormal presence was about to manifest in the house. And perhaps the butler would have laughed this off if it wasn't for what happened next. You see, elsewhere in the mansion, Shawn Mullen, remember the Bamford's former chauffeur who was helping with all of this? Shawn was preparing things for the guests when he happened to walk into the dining room of the house, the place they had thrown that party last night. He walked through a set of double doors, and as he did, he was suddenly stopped in his tracks. He said, on record, "I couldn't quite believe my eyes. This lady was walking towards me, a grey outline. She took 3 or 4 paces, at which point she turned at right angles and disappeared through the wall." He was absolutely shaken to have seen this, because Shawn did not believe in ghosts. But the woman had been transparent and had faded from view right in front of him. The mind-bending shock of this pushed him into a run, and he raced to get Karen, the family's housekeeper. He couldn't keep it in, he told her, and he also told the butler and the cook what had happened. And so the cook's face dropped, and she confirmed what had just happened moments before, that the black moth had been in the kitchen, heralding a paranormal manifestation. And Shawn and Karen asked the cook to explain more about this, and that's when she told them about the history of the house. The cook spoke of a truly awful incident that happened to a woman on that property. And despite it having happened 400 years ago, all the guests and staff had seen this woman. It was the lady from the dining room portrait. The cook explained that this woman and her husband had lived in the house as a count, and a contessa. The Contessa had struggled to have children, apparently, and so she decided to conceive through another lover. They both went to bed to become intimate. The bedroom, she said, was now the current dining room. The woman's husband came home and found them together, and seeing his wife in the arms of another man sent him into a wild rage. And in his fury, he grabbed a weapon. Remember how the walls in that room were filled with machetes and swords? Well, he took a weapon and he set upon his wife. Some sources say that he stabbed her to death, others that he decapitated her with a sword. Whatever the case, he had wound up his anger into a ball of hatred and used that power to slaughter his wife. Well, Karen and Shawn listened to the cook's story with astonishment, particularly because Shawn had only just witnessed a woman walking towards him in that very room. Could it be even possible that that was the Contessa? Well, I suppose Karen and Shawn could have kept all this to themselves, but they didn't. They told the cook's story to the rest of Lady Bamford's guests. Not only that, Shawn shared that he had also seen the ghostly woman. Now, they all listened with interest because Shawn and Karen were trusted people in this family. They'd been working for them for years, so why make up something like this? But Lady Carol Bamford wasn't particularly fazed. Surely Shawn had just been the victim of a trick of the light, of the imagination. And the cook's story happened hundreds of years ago. It's probably an old legend. Nothing to worry about in the modern times of 1994. And most importantly, I should imagine Carol did not want to spoil a special and expensive holiday after just one night. So the guests shrugged the story off and got on with the first full day of their trip, sightseeing in the beautiful European city around them. Meanwhile, Shawn and Karen left the Palazzo so they could gather supplies for the next meal. When they both returned in the afternoon, they were met by the butler, Gastone. He seemed disturbed and tugged them to follow him. He took them both into a dining room and showed them something startling. Can you remember that dinner confectionery I mentioned earlier? Those silver and gold wrapped sweets? Well, they were now lying on the dining room floor, and they'd been laid out in a pattern. Gastone insisted that he hadn't done it, and there was no one else in the house at that point. And the bowl that had contained them hadn't been tipped, it wasn't overturned. In fact, it was upright. It still had some sweets still in there. But it was the pattern that was particularly disturbing. They were kind of lying in what seemed to be almost like the shape of an S, or was it the shape of a body? Now, at this point, it's important to talk about sources. There are two key sources for the information about this case. In the 1990s, there was a paranormal documentary show on British TV called Strange But True. They ran an episode on the Joan Collins case in August 1996, August the 30th. It was a mere 2 years after the actual events. Joan Collins herself appears in that episode, testifying to the events, and you also get eyewitness accounts from Gastone, Karen, and Shawn. It makes for a compelling case when you realize all these people are risking their reputations by confirming what they experienced at the Palazzo. Joan also talked about this on the show Celebrity Ghost Stories on July 17, 2010. And in that, she again shares what happened. And one or two of the details seem different, at least at first. She says it was one of the teenagers who found the silver-colored sweets in the dining room, and that they were not so much in an S shape, but in the shape of a body. She even said that at that point, poltergeist activity began in the room. They saw a decorative pot, a kind of stand for flowers, sliding along the floor, and one of the knives from either the dining table or the wall decorations flew across the room. But if you watch the Strange But True episode, they suggest that the sweets were in the shape of an S and that Joan wasn't present. Now, details like this can lead some people out there, skeptics, to assume, well, that means it's all made up. But wait. In the Strange But True episode, Joan never said the sweets were in the shape of an S, or that she wasn't there to see them. It's just presented that way in the dramatic reconstruction parts. I think this is important. When London Weekend Television told her story, they created dramatic sort of reconstruction. And so while there are some variations, these differences, I think, seem to stem more from some of these dramatizations rather than Joan Collins' actual testimony. And besides, like any real-life experience, it's natural for memories to differ over time. What matters is, whatever night these things happened on and who witnessed it, what happens is the core of the story remains strikingly consistent, and there are multiple witnesses claiming it to be true. So, back on track. Whatever the shape of the sweets, someone or something had walked up to this bowl, scooped them out, and carefully laid them on the floor. What was happening in that room? Well, the guests may have been relieved that evening because the plan was not to eat in the mansion after all. Instead, they had booked a table at the birthplace of the Bellini cocktail, the famous Harry's Bar. Stars like Orson Welles, Charlie Chaplin, Katharine Hepburn, and Truman Capote had all been to this bar, which was built in 1931. And so they went there. They had a fabulous time eating dinner at Harry's, not least because they'd had white truffles. They are extremely expensive. And Joan said the bill was, quote, extraordinarily high, which had them all laughing at the sheer decadence of the night. And so giggling, they all climbed into the water taxi and traveled the canals on their way back to the Palazzo. Now, this is interesting. Joan said it was during that boat trip that a distinct shift in mood occurred. They'd been giddy with the fun and excitement of this holiday together, but the closer they got to the Palazzo, the more uneasy they became. The laughter, the smiles, they just seemed to sink into the canal, and they did not resurface. Well, they disembarked the water taxi and walked in a kind of quiet dread towards the door of the mansion, wondering what the second night might have in store for them. Well, as they trudged into the Palazzo, they heard the groan and rumble of thunder overhead. The heavens opened with one of the most intense storms for many years. I checked the weather reports for northern Italy in September 1994, and I can confirm that there was indeed an outbreak of intense storms and tornadoes around that time, specifically between 31st of August and 14th of September. So Joan's story of the storm tracks here. In fact, I learned that 23 people had died in those storms. The wind was so strong, I found a news report where some small planes were blown into each other, which knocked down an airport crane that killed one of the operators. Well as this storm, remember how they celebrated Hugo Guinness's birthday the night before? His birthday is the 12th of September. So putting all these dates together, it means that Joan Collins's spine-chilling 2 nights at the Palazzo must have happened on the 12th and 13th of September 1994, which, after checking the records, marked the climax of the storm outbreak that hit the region at the time. Shawn, in the Strange But True episode, says that the storm was so intense that the wind was getting into the cracks and blowing the net curtains into the rooms like arms reaching. This storm was so bad that it affected the electricity. And the lights started flickering so madly that it became distracting and unpleasant, and they had no other choice. They had to switch the lights off. Instead, they gathered by candlelight, with flames flickering from tall candelabras. But the vastness of that house swallowed the light, leaving much of the room cloaked in an eerie gloom. And they waited there as the storm howled and wailed beyond the walls, their eyes fixed on the heavy, shadow-filled corners, wondering if some of those shadows might be looking back at them. They were frankly becoming scared in that mansion and began to discuss if it was safe for them to stay. But then Karen noticed something. She was walking through the dining room at one point that second night, and she just happened to notice a looming figure in the candlelight. She was, of course, shocked, at least at first, but then she began to wonder, wait, isn't that just a trick of the light? And she turned to Shawn and said, "Aha! This is what you saw. You didn't see a ghost, you just saw a shadow against the wall." Now, Shawn wasn't believing this particularly, but Karen was assembling the other guests and showed them this light trick and how the shadow seemed to vanish whenever you walked towards it. And it was, quite frankly, a creepy illusion, but an illusion nonetheless, created by the angles and the light of the house. Karen may have hoped this would calm the guests down, but they were still feeling thoroughly creeped out. And if they were going to stay, they asked to have at least electric torches or flashlights so they could navigate the dark pathways to their bedrooms. Shawn nodded and went to fetch the torches, and that is when something deeply unsettling happened. To get there, he had to pass the portrait of the Contessa. With everything that had already happened, he couldn't resist glancing up at her eyes. He looked at that painting countless times before, of course, but this moment was different. His gaze locked onto hers, and something shifted in him. Something no one could have expected. From that portrait came a sudden wave of grief that crashed over him. This was raw, overwhelming sorrow that didn't feel like his own. And before he could understand what was happening, tears filled his eyes and began streaming down his cheeks. It's not clear who was with him at this particular moment, but at least one guest was. I think it was Hugo, who watched Shawn frozen in place, staring up at the painting as if some invisible force had locked him there. One moment this guy was fine, the next he was overcome, sobbing uncontrollably. It was a head-spinning moment. Well, Hugo took Shawn and told him, "We've got to get you out of here." And he dragged him out and away from the furious gaze of the painting. When the rest of the guests saw the state of Shawn, they were in shock. They asked Shawn what had just happened to him, and he agreed to take them back into the dining room, just at least so he could explain. But just as he was about to speak and describe it, a shocking moment came. He looked back up at the Contessa's eyes that seemed filled with rage, and his face just twisted in pain and terror. He clutched his chest, and then with a shriek of dismay from the other guests, Shawn just dropped hard to the floor as if he was having some sort of heart attack. Now, thankfully, it wasn't a heart attack, but it did appear to be some kind of attack. Hugo, the one whose birthday it had been the night before, spoke about this moment many years later in an unexpected place. In 2019, Hugo was interviewing the celebrated film director Wes Anderson. I'm sure you might have heard of many of his films. And at one point, Wes Anderson turned the tables and asked a question of Hugo. Wes Anderson was clearly aware of what happened to Hugo, Joan, and the others at the Palazzo.
This might not be relevant to the article, but wasn't it the last time you were in Venice?
Oh, when I got spooked.
The ghost story.
Yes, I have not been back to Venice since.
What was the Palazzo called? Where it happened?
It was called the Palazzo Albrizzi.
Who did it belong to?
The Albrizzi family. We had a terrifying experience.
Maybe this is a good time to get your Palazzo Albrizzi ghost story out into the world. What happened again?
The Palazzo is famously haunted, as you know, and I was there with a group of friends for my 30th birthday. The trouble started when a black butterfly was spotted in the kitchen by the staff. They knew what was about to happen and liked it. We went out to dinner at Harry's bar, and when we came back, we found the butler fixed to the floor, unable to move. When I touched him, I got an electric charge through my body. All the furniture started flying around the room. We found out afterwards there was a poltergeist.
Now this is interesting. This idea of him getting this charge when he touched Shawn. Static electricity is the buildup of an electric charge on a surface. It gives you a small shock when you touch a doorknob, or it makes your hair stand on end on a dry day. Well, it's normally harmless and common, but some paranormal researchers believe that ghosts or spirits might influence static electric fields. The science behind it all is debated, but there are reports like this one where people felt a sudden electrical charge or jolt from another person during a haunting. Maybe it explains why some electrical equipment seems to be affected in haunted places. So Shawn was a wreck at this point, but Hugo and the others managed to lift him from the floor and took him aside. And as he found his voice again, Shawn told them something remarkable. He said that as he had looked at the portrait this time, he hadn't been hit with sadness as such, but he had suddenly felt a tremendous pressure on his body, specifically on his back. It was like something or someone had either descended onto him and was pressing all their weight into the floor, trying to push him into the floor, or was this crawling up on top of him to press down? He just said it was absolutely crazy and painful too. He described it as a ton weight and that he had never felt anything like it before. Again, what Shawn experienced, that crushing invisible pressure on his back, is fascinating, and similar sensations can occur in sleep paralysis, for example, though it can happen when some people are awake. I read a paranormal report once of a woman who stayed in a hotel, and just after her husband left the room, she heard something scrambling across the floor, and then it jumped up on the bed and it pinned her down with a heavy weight, but she was awake the whole time. I even had my own experience of not only being pinned to the bed, but having my legs bounced up and down by something that wasn't even there. It was an insane sensation. You'll find the video about that here. But Shawn was standing upright at the time, not asleep at all, and the sensation, however, seems very similar. The forceful pushing seemed targeted, deliberate, and unsettling, and humiliating, almost as if whatever was in that room was trying to dominate him. Did the house sense his disbelief and want to prove him wrong? Well, after attending to Shawn, Karen looked across the room at the portrait and she walked up to it. She wanted to maybe explain what it was, or she was just curious. But something extraordinary happened to her. As she approached the painting of the woman, she seemed to step into a pocket of shocking coldness. I don't mean that there was a wind from the storm outside. That would have been reasonable. I mean, she took like one single step and stepped into an impossibly cold space. There was such a distinct difference between the steps. She said it was like literally crossing a line. I felt as if I was walking into a fridge. And she stood in that eerie, freezing patch, staring up and shivering at the portrait of the woman. Remember, just moments before, she had thought she had explained it all with shadows and light, and now she too was transfixed by the eyes of this Contessa. And then get this, she began to have a similar experience to Shawn. She said of the woman in the portrait, "Her eyes seemed to look straight through me. I just felt very cut off and very distant, as if hypnotized, almost into a different world." Well, Shawn and the other guests saw her transfixed by the painting, and they rushed over to her. They dragged Karen away from the portrait, fearful that she might experience the same physical assault as Shawn had, or worse. And she knew as they pulled her away that what was happening in that mansion was not a trick of the light or an imagination running wild. The supernatural was at play. And whatever that supernatural presence was, it did not want them there. Well, when Shawn saw it affecting Karen, he got angry. He stormed up to the painting and demanded whatever was behind it to stop this. He shouldn't have, because he felt that weight come back onto him again, only this time it was much, much worse. He said, "The pressure was 3 or 4 times as heavy. My shoulders were being squeezed together so hard that it felt like my blood was bubbling and boiling." And again he dropped to the floor under the power of it. Well, the guests ran towards him, and Joan Collins said, "This is a very stalwart man in his 40s, who looks like he could certainly say boo to a goose, who has become a sort of gibbering wreck." And this is when they knew, of course, that they would not spend another night or even another hour in the Palazzo. Lady Bamford told them all to gather their things. Despite the late hour, despite the storm, they were getting out right now. Karen said an interesting thing about this moment. She had organised this trip, and so seeing people abandon it so easily could have been crushing and humiliating. But by this point, Karen had no sense of failure. She just had a sense of relief that they were finally getting out. She said, "When Lady Bamford made the decision to leave, I was relieved. I couldn't wait to get out of the Palazzo." Now, Robin and Hugo had to grab a few things, so they were separated from the others for a while. Remember that, because that's important. But the rest of them got what they could and hurried out of the Palazzo. I wonder, have you ever been in a scary place and you've hurried to leave it? I have a few times, and sometimes I feel the fear heighten when I run away, as if whatever has scared me is going to be running after me and racing in pursuit if I look back. So maybe the guests had that feeling too as they raced out of the place because they were scared. The 2 teenage girls, Alice Bamford and her friend Caroline Wellesley, were terrified. Apparently they were shaking with the shock of it all. Joan Collins was certainly scared too, but in that moment she remembered something her parents had taught her in World War II. Joan had lived through the Blitz, a sustained Nazi bombing campaign that pummeled Britain from 1940 to 1941. It forced civilians to flee their homes and hide underground. It was a genuinely frightening experience. But she remembered how in the Blitz, her parents had taught her, if you get scared, sing. It'll take your mind off the horrible things that are happening around you. And so as they raced out of the Palazzo, Joan Collins began singing. They were all disturbed and frightened. And yet Joan was doing all she could to take their and her minds off what had just happened to them. Karen said, "If it wasn't for Joan, I think it would have really been a state of panic." Now you might think this was the end of the ordeal once they got out of the house, but can you remember Robin and Hugo were still inside? They were rushing through the Palazzo, suitcases in hand, to get out and join the others, when they made a chilling discovery. While running, they heard a sound from the mansion. Unsure of what it was, they looked into one of the rooms and they were horrified to see several kitchen knives. They had been stabbed hard into one of the surfaces, and these knives had not been put there before by any of the other staff. The house had done it. Or rather, whoever walked the halls of that house. Now, this detail about the knives is presented in the Strange But True episode through a dramatization. And if you remember, Joan said that the knife incident happened with a blade flying across the room when she saw it. So I actually tend to take the actual witness testimony as the key source. So whether Hugo and Robin saw the knives at the end, or this is a conflation of the knife incident that Joan and the others saw, I don't know. But I don't think any of that really detracts from the fact that the force in this house was throwing and stabbing knives. And what's more, Joan said that they could see the handles of the blades quivering, which made it clear that these knives had only just been rammed in. The idea of knives being placed, thrown, or stabbed into surfaces might sound stupid and dramatic to some of you out there, but if you know anything about the paranormal, you'll quickly discover that it is a surprisingly common feature of poltergeists and hauntings. Elsewhere on my channel, you will find multiple examples of ordinary, everyday people in haunted locations who find knives stabbed into floors, walls, or left in beds even, or even, in one case which is particularly disturbing, rammed up through chairs so that the unsuspecting tenant might sit down onto the blade and seriously injure themselves. The idea of knives being used in this way means poltergeists and haunted houses are not always just mischievous or playful spirits. In some cases, they appear to threaten actual violence. Well, the men found the others outside, who were clearly worried by the expression on their faces, but they didn't stop to discuss it. They all just rushed off into the Venetian night with no idea where they were going. All they knew was that after 2 nights, just 2, they would never set foot in the Palazzo Albrizzi again. Well, I'm sure she didn't want to, but Karen Keeling had to return to the mansion the following morning. The guests still had some more luggage there, you see, and so she agreed to collect it. She took a deep breath and headed inside. Perhaps it felt safer in the daylight, perhaps not. Whatever the case, when she went into the house, she heard noises. It was the butler, Gastone Boragama, and the cook, the one who had warned them all about the moth. Karen was very apologetic, saying, "Well, so sorry we didn't tell you. The guests would not be back." And she was honest about the reason. She said they had fled in the middle of the night because some kind of paranormal force had driven them out. The cook's reaction to this was interesting. She almost had a look of nervous inevitability and said that this wasn't the first time people had been driven out of the mansion by the paranormal. And she told Karen and Gastone the story of a man who had stayed at the Palazzo 10 years before and had had a very disturbing experience. It was around the year 1984 when a man, I don't know his name, came to stay overnight at the mansion. He went to bed with no particular issues and settled in one of the rooms, drifted off into sleep. Some time later, however, he found his eyes fluttering open. Don't know what had woken him. But as his eyes adjusted to the room, he had a horrifying realization. He was no longer in the bedroom. He was in the dining room. And what's more, he was on his knees. As he came to consciousness, he looked and saw that his hands were clasped together in prayer. Totally disorientated, he gradually looked up and he realized that he was kneeling at the foot of the portrait of the woman, praying to it. He flung his hands apart in shock, terrified at the sheer wildness of the moment. And he was so horrified by the experience that as soon as the morning came, he packed up his stuff and he fled that place in terror. Now, some of you out there might find yourself tempted to shrug and say, "So the guy was a sleepwalker. Big deal." Hang on a sec. If he was a sleepwalker, he may well have been used to going to sleep and waking up in odd places. He would have potentially dismissed that as an annoyance, but he didn't, did he? The single incident was enough to send him running from the place the next day. It suggests to me, at least, that this was not a normal experience for him at all. Besides, sleepwalkers do indeed wake up in different places, and they can even perform simple tasks. And yet, he was kneeling and praying. It's not common for a sleepwalker to engage in a complex and emotionally symbolic behavior like this while in sleep, and while nailing at a specific portrait. And the third point is the word specific. That place was filled with rooms and artwork and paintings. Why was he guided, even in sleep, to the painting of the Contessa? More to the point, was he praying in fear because something terrible had happened to him? Or was he praying to the portrait as some kind of disturbing veneration to the woman in it? If the others hadn't stopped Shawn, might his hands too have joined together in a twisted prayer to her? it's like people were being dominated by the presence of either the spirit of the woman or something else that lurked within that painting. Either way, the woman in the portrait had now driven at least 2 men to the floor in some symbolic act of submission. Well, the cook finished her story, and she insisted that this experience was not over for the guests. They had created a connection with the presence in the house, and something had to be done to sever it. And her plan to achieve this was simple and yet extraordinary. The cook told Karen that she must go back to Joan, Lady Bamford, and the others, and she must bring them all back to the mansion. Karen, of course, was not impressed with this suggestion. They'd all ran to escape that place last night, but no, the cook explained they didn't have to stay here another night, but every one of them did need to return to the dining room. And once there, she said that they must each in turn apologize to the portrait. It was because they had dined in that room and laughed and drank and ate in that awful place where that woman had brutally lost her life. The cook said it had to be made right. Karen was worried enough about this situation to take the cook's advice, and she went back to the guests and told them what needed to be done. Did they laugh this off as a bizarre and silly ritual? No. They'd all been so affected by those 2 nights that they really did feel an uneasy connection to the mansion now, and they genuinely wanted to do whatever it took to get unhooked from that. And so they did it. They all went back to the Palazzo, despite their fear of the place, and they went to the dining room, and they each walked up to the portrait in turn and apologized. Part of me wondered if, in the warm light of day, they might find this dreadfully amusing, like the room would fill with awkward giggles at this bizarre ritual. But no, Karen said of that moment, "The atmosphere was very still and very quiet, and one by one everyone walked up to the painting. It was almost like taking communion at church." They each stood before the staring eyes of the painted woman and said, "Mi dispiace," which means, "I'm sorry." Joan Collins is very open with researchers and reporters about this. She said that she lined up along with everybody else to apologize to the woman. The staff did the same too. After all, they had facilitated the invasion into her space. And once done, they all left the Palazzo, and this time, they would never, ever return. Have you noticed how celebrity ghost stories can be taken less seriously than more general paranormal cases? People can think it's just another dramatic tale from a person used to the spotlight or indeed seeking publicity. In fact, Joan Collins shared how she used some of the details of her night in Venice as the inspiration for a scene in one of her novels. That sort of detail can lead some skeptics to assume, the entire incident was made up as some kind of book promotion. I'm not so sure. I also found a YouTube comment from a man called Jake Cavendish. He claims to have met a member of the Albrizzi family when he attended university, the people who owned the Palazzo at the time. Jake claims that the Bamford's party had gotten out of hand and they were all kicked out of the building, and they made up this ghost story to cover up the embarrassment. It's an intriguing idea, but there's just no further evidence for this eviction claim. If you can find it, let me know. Yet on Joan Collins' side, we have multiple people on record saying that what she said happened. I don't think it's fair to dismiss a dramatic story just because it involves a Hollywood actress. Because the paranormal doesn't particularly care if you're a glamorous celebrity or a lord or a lady or an ordinary family in a terraced suburban house. Everyone is left just as shaken as each other. Fame and riches do not shield you from fear or the unknown. And glossy dramatizations on TV shows can be great, but they can make these cases sometimes feel a little step removed from us. But for the people who lived through them, there is nothing theatrical about it. The fear is real, and the confusion lasting. And in that Venetian mansion, everyone felt it. From Joan herself to the household staff, to Shawn Mullins and Karen Keeling, who were especially traumatized by these events. Did you know that after they left Venice, both Shawn and Karen were plagued with horrendous nightmares, and a horrible sense of connection to the Palazzo. Was it possible that the spirit of that house had followed them back to England? Well, they seem to think so, because both of them decided to seek out a spiritual solution. They both went to the church and asked for prayer and blessing so that they might stop feeling followed by this unwanted presence from the mansion. And they said that it was only after the church intervened that the nightmares finally receded. Joan Collins herself said that her experience at the Palazzo was not the scariest of her life, but that's because, she's endured real trauma. And if you look into her life story, she's been through some horrific stuff at the hands of males, something the Contessa in the portrait knew a lot about. Yet even though she said it wasn't the absolute scariest experience of her life, she has described those 2 nights in Palazzo as terrifying, and even today, she still says it is the absolutely strangest experience of her life. It was an experience that has certainly stayed with me. It's not something that has blurred with time. And when asked if she would ever go back to the mansion again, Joan Collins is adamant. I wouldn't go back to the Palazzo again. No, definitely not. So what do you make of this case? Did they really have an encounter with the paranormal that night in Venice? Comment below with one word to cast your vote. Write haunted if you believe it was something paranormal. Write hoax if you think it was all in the imagination or suggestion or just a made-up tale. Or write haunted ? If you're not sure, but the story still got under your skin. Let's see which word fills the comments, and we'll collate the results as a YouTube post. Do check out our posts for other overviews of the comment sections to these videos, because they can really be fascinating. But maybe the core point is not where is the Palazzo, or where is the dining room even. What if it's simply about the portrait? Where is that today? Is it still on the premises? Has it been moved elsewhere? Do you live in a house with a painting of a woman your parents bought at a European auction? What if it's her? Throughout history, certain objects seem to have absorbed more than dust. They hold on to echoes of grief, obsession, betrayal, even murder. If you have stories of such objects, share them in the comments below. But before you do, look around your own home. That mirror you never really liked. The clock that stopped but you never threw it away. The forgotten dusty box in the attic. The photograph that no one seems to remember taking. What are you going to do if you fall asleep tonight and then wake up kneeling in front of one of those things in frantic prayer? As we discover that sometimes the things we think we own may actually own us. I'm Peter Laws, and you've been listening to Into the Fog. Good night.